When you live on a steep hill, as we do, garden planning and gardening can be more challenging than on a flat piece of ground.
But it's also much more exciting. It's fun to do, and creating different levels in the garden adds so much more interest throughout the seasons, as you can look up, down or along the garden to view the flowers, foliage, seed heads and branches from so many varied angles.
Our hill slopes steeply away from the house, dropping down to the River Severn. It's south-facing, so potentially very hot and dry in the summer, but can also be extremely wet during the rest of the year.
We needed a garden design solution which retained the soil and our plants during winter storms, and ideally some level areas from which we could both maintain and admire our new garden.
For us, terraces were the way to go when faced with the challenge of a hill. Gravel seemed an obvious choice as the ground cover. It's a great look and also lower maintenance, ideal just in front of the house.
This video will show the planning, design and build of our gravel garden on 2 terraces directly in front of the house and patio. This includes the building of extensive dry stone walls, creating many new garden beds, and also adding a small pond to the second terrace beside a seating area.
Life before the gravel garden.
Previous owners of our house had started the hard work of terracing many years ago. They had created 2 very basic rectangular terraces in front of the house.
However, by the time we moved in, these narrow terraces were crumbling away, the ugly and tumble-down concrete block walls built to keep them in place, collapsing in front of our very eyes.
There were no garden beds, just scrappy lawns covered in rubbish at the time. The 2 neglected terraces were bordered by high overgrown hedges and smothered in brambles.
Below them, further down the hill, were a few old apple trees, the remainder of a small orchard and fruit garden.
Once we had decided on retaining and developing these terraces for our new garden, the next questions came very quickly.
What should we use to hold back the earth when building our new terrace walls?
What shape would our terraces be? Would they be straight or curved?
And how would we move down from one terrace to another? Would there be steps?
And what type of garden did we want on top of the 2 new terraces we were planning to create?
We had recently visited 2 quite different gardens on opposite sides of the UK and been inspired to be more ambitious in our thinking.
Beth Chatto's garden in Essex has a gorgeous gravel garden. Garden beds in the gravel there were full of plants that enjoyed dry conditions and would struggle in mid-Wales, but the principle of a gravel garden appealed.
Once created, it would require less ongoing maintenance than a small lawn and borders directly in front of the house. We didn't want to be mowing every 5 minutes, and we had other rough lawns elsewhere already in the garden.
The idea was to create the background structure and then plant with a wild theme into curving beds and let greenery spill out onto the gravel.
The National Trust's Paris Castle Garden near Welshpool in North Paris is about 45 minutes drive from home.
This amazing garden, whilst impossible to replicate in a domestic situation, is very inspiring with its towering terraces and beautiful plantings sheltered by the high walls and hedges.
We decided to experiment in our new garden, making terraces with curved dry stone walls. We loved the miles of dry stone walls seen in North Wales and the Yorkshire Dales.
It was a very ambitious plan. If we'd known exactly how much work it would involve and how long the project would take, we probably never would have started.
The first step was to draw out some rough plans on paper and try and imagine what our terraces would look like. We also created a mood board with photographs of walls and gardens which had inspired us.
The next step was to learn some essential new skills. We had never made dry stone walls before. Where to start?
We bought some really useful books, read them cover to cover many times, and decided to practice by replacing another tumble-down concrete block wall by our car parking area.
First of all, though, we had to visit a local quarry to choose several tons of stone, which was then delivered and piled up ready to use. The sight of this enormous pile of rock was both exciting and a little overwhelming at the same time.
The new wall took many months to build in our spare time.
We learnt about digging foundations, creating footings with the larger stones, through stones and batters, building a wall that slopes back as it grows taller, the hearting, smaller stones that go behind the face stones, and how on each course new stones cover the joins on the previous layer.
What we quickly discovered was that dry stone walling is hard physical work, but actually very therapeutic.
Eventually, the wall in our parking area was finished and much admired by everyone. This wall, though, was mainly straight.
Back on the terraces, we began transferring the designs from from paper to the ground, laying out ropes and black plastic to define the shapes we were aiming for.
Once happy, we dug out the foundations for the new walls. Big, bold, sweeping curves which made much wider terraces than previously before starting to build. We had to be brave and try and imagine what it would be like when the walls were complete, as once started, there was no going back.
Dry stone walls took several years to complete in total, as we did all the work ourselves. It was a very big project which we had to fit in between other gardening tasks and other daily commitments like work.
But it was very satisfying seeing them grow. We also had to barrow in large quantities of soil from other areas in our garden to extend the terraces. Luckily, we were also planning our ponds at this time, which meant we had spare soil from digging the holes for these.
Eventually, the first delivery of rocks ran out and we had to return to the quarry to choose more. This second huge pile was dropped right in front of our house, next to the wall building work.
Both terraces incorporated a set of new dry stone steps into the wall. Building dry stone steps was another challenge to read up about in our books before embarking on the build.
Steps need to be built at the same time as the wall, as they tie into the walls at the side to create solid structures. Finding rocks with flat surfaces to create our steps was the hardest task.
Finally, after what seemed like an age, the walls were complete. We were very pleased. The rock in the walls looked beautiful and created the perfect setting for planting.
The next step was to lay the gravel surface.
First, we chose those areas we wanted to turn into garden beds. The remainder of each terrace was levelled roughly and prepared first with a layer of landscape fabric to keep the weeds suppressed.
We bought gravel in bulk in large bags, each holding about a cubic metre of different coloured stones from our local builder's yard. They also delivered.
We spread the gravel in a layer about 5 centimetres deep on top of the landscape fabric. This size bag of gravel covers about 20 square metres. In this way, we created gravel paths and areas around the new beds on our terraces.
Every now and again we top up our gravel paths as needed. Some of the stones inevitably end up in the garden beds.
Once the terraces were complete, we designed and built a small pond on the second terrace just below the dry stone wall holding up terrace number 1.
You can find out more about the planning, design and build of this pond in our earlier video. We made 2 ponds.
Finally, it was time to plant up the garden beds.
These garden beds are directly below our house, and we wanted to plant them to give interest all year round as we look out at them from the doors and windows. With this in mind, we drew up plans featuring small ornamental trees, shrubs, grasses, perennials and bulbs.
Gravel gardens are often associated with Mediterranean-style plantings. Here in mid-Wales, typical drought-tolerant plants such as lavender, sage and santolina tend to struggle in our wet climate, so over the years we have adapted our plantings to suit the weather conditions.
Even so, some plants have still succumbed to the wet Welsh winters, and we have been tempted by new discoveries at nurseries or been gifted plants by family and friends.
So the plantings continue to evolve even now.
Before planting the trees, shrubs and perennials we had chosen, we enriched the nutrient-poor soil with homemade compost.
Then the hole digging began and in went the new plants.
In the early days, when the plantings were new, they were quite low to the ground.
But after several years, the tiny Japanese maple trees matured into beautiful specimens taller than us, along with shrubs such as weigela, smokebush, hibiscus and witch hazel.
In the tree layer there are also a couple of variegated hollies, a lilac, a weeping silver-leafed pear and a dwarf ornamental cherry. Now these are older and taller, we do have to keep on top of pruning each year to stop them growing too high.
Tall grasses such as Stipa gigantea and Miscanthus sinensis blow in the breeze. Popular perennials are all kinds of hardy geraniums such as Patricia and Johnson's blue, astilbes, phlox, echinops, euphorbia and Shasta daisies. We have grown some of these perennials successfully from seed, including verbascum, snowy spires, echinacea and astrantia.
Others were chosen for wildlife. Sedum autumn joy attracts pollinators such as butterflies and moths.
Climbers such as alpine clematis and rose warm welcome are encouraged to grow up hazel supports or clamber up into the shrubs.
Annuals such as Welsh poppies seed themselves prolifically every year.
Nearly all our ornamental plants are survivors, hardy and tolerant of sometimes trying conditions. Some, such as Lysimachia ciliata firecracker, can actually be quite invasive and need weeding out themselves sometimes.
The most successful bulbs are snowdrops, dwarf daffodils and grape hyacinths.
Every year we try new tulips, but unfortunately the squirrels love digging up and eating them. Ornamental alliums will last a year or two before succumbing to the winter damp. We have to treat them as bedding, really.
Here are some other plants from these gravel beds.
Over the years, we have found that some plants thrive growing in the cracks in the dry stone walls.
Mostly these are plants that have spread from the garden beds or been seeded by birds or small animals.
These include saxifrage, London Pride, reflex stonecrop and Ajuga reptans burgundy glow. Ferns will also seed really easily into the walls and, if allowed, grow quite massive. Most are pulled out, but a few have been left as they look so dramatic, waving in the breeze.
Once the pond was complete, it seemed only natural to create a small seating area from where we could enjoy watching pond life, frogs, dragonflies and water boatmen.
We're on our second garden bench and there are also now 2 small box balls which we propagated ourselves from cuttings.
There is also an excellent view of the bird table from here, and our inherited bird bath sits nearby and is used frequently, especially during dry summers.
A couple of years ago I missed dry stone walling so much I decided to make a small dry stone table next to the bench with a slab of slate to finish it off. With this feature I did use a small amount of cement in the central core to give additional stability.
Here are some clips of our gravel terraces and dry stone walls through the seasons.
Spring. Summer. Autumn. Winter. There are a few issues that crop up in relation to dry stone walls and gravel terraces. None are very trying. Sometimes it's all about being more tolerant as gardeners of the wonders of nature all around us, but let's touch on a few.
Eventually, even rock in a dry stone wall will begin to weather and break down. Repairs can be made by sliding replacement stones into the gaps, or just tolerated as new spots for plants to grow.
Here in Wales, moss will indeed grow anywhere and everywhere if allowed, so some of our walls are now very green and wet, especially in the winter.
We mostly leave the moss. There are many different and beautiful varieties. Occasionally some is peeled off, especially on the steps where it can become quite slippery.
Small mammals such as bank voles and other creatures, especially slugs and snails, do like to live in dry stone walls, so we cannot be surprised if these animals come to feast on our plants, usually at night.
For this reason, we don't even bother adding plants beloved by these residents, such as hostas, and plants we all love have to be shared. The slugs take some echinacea, but others are left for us to enjoy.
Drainage is good, but in a long hot summer with little rain, beds raised up above dry stone walls can quickly dry out. We try not to water except in exceptional circumstances when we see that plants are struggling.
Weeding is inevitable in ornamental gardens, but after the first couple of years was kept to a minimum in this area of our garden due to the tight planting.
In summer there is very little bare soil to be seen. Also, weeds are quickly spotted directly outside the house and easily pulled out when passing before becoming problematic. The dry stone walls holding up our gravel terraces and garden beds were all our own work, and we loved every minute of building them.
A gravel garden is the perfect place to unwind after a busy day at work.
It's the ideal spot too for a Pilates session or playing music, as we discovered during the pandemic.
We really enjoy watching the many birds, amphibians, mammals and insects that share our garden with us in this spot.
And appreciate the beautiful trees and flowering plants on so many different levels. Literally. So, even in damp mid-Wales, it is possible to create a beautiful gravel garden where plants will thrive.
Thanks for watching, and happy terrace and gravel gardening all!